Inhale and exhale, so that breath by breath, you are connected to what is here. Breath by breath, you are here. Breath by breath, you are present. Close your eyes, if you have not done so already, and allow yourself to move fully into your heart space. This is where we begin. I acknowledge that the events recounted in this book took place in Treaty 6 territory of Alberta, Canada. I call in your ancestors and I call in mine. Grandmothers and grandfathers, we honor you. Those who have gone before us, those who are here now, and those who are yet to come. Those who breathed us into being and those who we are breathing now, welcome. Ancient ones, I beseech you to encircle us with your wisdom. Help us find the courage necessary to tend the needs of our soul. May this soul work be our priority. May we choose ourselves and our healing over the need to please others. May we choose ourselves, our authentic, wild, and soul-felt selves, and our fractured and our broken selves. And through this choice, may it be known that we are naming ourselves as whole and worthy. Guide us through the fires of adversity and conflict in such a way that we are strengthened. Help us to be with our greatest fears so that they no longer have the power to bind us, and teach us to listen to our gut instinct. I welcome in our helping spirits, yours and mine, known and unknown, protectors, allies, and guides, power animals, angelic ones, mythical beings, be with us. Open our vision to the multifaceted perspective you are here to share with us. Help us feel safe in being vulnerable, to get out of our heads and awaken to our profound connection with all of our relations. May this awakening change us. Gathering this prayer up, we move it through the midline of our bodies, down through our legs and our root chakras, so we're grounded in the medicine of the Mother Earth below. Sending our roots out and down in every direction simultaneously, we are anchored and connected to all that is needed to feed our body, mind, and spirit. Great Mother, by all the names in which we know you, I welcome you intentionally into this space. Support us in stopping and listening while the story is told. Help each person tune in to what they must hear to support their own healing journey. Leave what is not necessary for them and share what is in support of the healing of all beings. Help each reader identify and acknowledge their own unresolved suffering without measuring or comparing, and in turn foster the nourishment needed to heal. Also, Great Mother, I am going to speak of heinous acts of violence against a woman, my mother, and I need help in creating a container to hold this. May this be solid and strong, and may the telling of this tale support women and family members of women who have been impacted by abuse and violence. Gathering this prayer up, we breathe it up through our bodies, letting it move up the midline of our spine and extend out over our crown chakra as if we are the tree of life itself, with branches moving out in every direction simultaneously, touching all that is above us. Great mystery, by all the names in which we know you, God, Goddess, Creator, Great Spirit, Source, I welcome you into this space. May grace be the power that motivates and inspires what is written and what is read. May we each touch the divine light within ourselves and realize the truth of who we are. May this touching of the sacred galvanize what we see, what we hear, and what we do. Open each of us to the infinite possibilities of this moment. Also, Great Spirit, I'm going to share stories of the degrading acts committed in the name of colonization, white supremacy, institutional racism, and misused power. Please help to create a container that may not only hold us, but transform this. Allow the healing and the telling of this tale to weave its energy in support of shared humanity and reconciliation. Breath by breath, coming back into our heart centers, inhale by exhale, noticing your presence as you're grounded between heaven and earth in service of all of our relations. May it be so. Sarah Salter Kelly, White Raven Woman, Winter Solstice 2019. So allowing yourselves to bring your awareness back into this space. Welcome, everybody. This is the first time that I've actually read that prayer in my talks. Often I'll make one up in the moment. However, it felt poignant to use a specific directive that had come to me in writing the book. And so what I want to do is to take you back through time right now, and to December 7th of 1995. And what's interesting in sharing here today is that the literal location that I'm going to take you to, my daughter and I just drove by when I was dropping her off earlier. And so one of the things that seems to me to be so true about trauma is that it highlights a time period in our lives where we can be so, there's so much adrenaline in our body that we can remember every detail of certain instances where sometimes if you ask me what I did yesterday, I have no idea. But when I bring my memory back in time to the 10 days that my mother was a missing person, I could tell you everything that happened from the moment that I woke up on that first morning until the moment that her body was found. In the telling of that tale and in the writing of this manuscript or this book, there was many years that went into unpacking and being with and listening deeply to what was needed in this tale, feeling the emotions that needed to be felt, listening to my own connection with spirit, which is what is the name that I tend to use for source or for God. And so finding that way to really connect and be in a place of presence, and that takes so much time. Initially, those first 10 days actually took up about 200 pages. And the manuscript that I thought was finished about 2 years ago. And when I began the 2-year journey that I've been on, which included, selling almost everything that I owned and moving to BC with Mark and our last kid at home, I had the time in that first year to really sit with what I wanted this book to look like. And I decided that all of those details were not necessary, that instead to pull forth the pieces that came through the years that highlighted some of the poignant moments that helped to guide each of us in our soul healing, whether these were ones that came through my own experience or that I've had the honor of witnessing through teaching programs or supporting people in private sessions through the years. It's important to know that what I share comes completely from the point of view as a human and as a healer. I am not a therapist, I'm not a psychologist. I have not been to university. I dropped out of high school. Everything that I come to comes from a place of real intentional presence to trust in myself and what I believe is inherent in all humans, in our capacity for deep listening. And the spiritual quest that I've been on started at a real young age when I was about 17, and I found out there were such things as real witches and they were good. And I thought, gosh, I always knew that should be true. And at 17, I devoutly promised myself to serve the goddess and creation. And, if there was a school I could have enrolled in at the time, I would have. And instead, I found myself out on the land, listening and in prayer and creating my own rituals and ceremonies. And I speak to that because as I've unpacked and been curious about what gave me the wherewithal to think that I could forgive my mother's perpetrator or come to a place of peace and reconciliation with homicide. And as I look back through the years, a lot of it was connected to those first 4 years I had on my own. For you see, I was kicked out or I moved out when I was 15 years old, both on the same day. Right, right? I didn't come home on Halloween. It's a long story. And right around that time period, I went from the suburbs, the west end of Edmonton, to downtown. And I spent the next few years in some really precarious situations as from being homeless and hungry to hitchhiking to South or to Vancouver. And in that experience, I came to discover that when I had nothing and I thought that I was gonna die, literally, or I wouldn't have a place to live, or I wouldn't have anything to eat, that the universe always provided. And I learned that I could fall back on that. So I developed a trust at a young age that I don't know if it is very common for most people to trust from some of those experiences. So when I take you with me to December of 1995, I was 20 years old and I was in such a deep place of trust. I thought I knew everything. And not that that's common for 20-year-olds to think that, but I thought I knew absolutely everything. I had, this devout spiritual path. I had life figured out. I was also put in personal growth workshops from the time I was about 13 as well, right? A personal development. And so I thought I had this great boyfriend who 27 years later is still my partner. And, so I thought, yeah, I know what's going on, right? And the thing about trauma is that it makes you unpack all of your beliefs, everything that you think is true, all of your certainty, as it turns your whole world upside down. And now it's important to note that I have specific instances in my life that earmarked this for me. Some people don't have a specific instance. It could be a continual pattern of neglect or abuse or suffering that builds up to an experience of trauma. So it's just important to point that out, because so often we can hear someone's story and we think, wow, that's horrible. I never had that, I'm fine. And yet if there is emotions that we're afraid to acknowledge, or things that happen that we never want to talk about, then there's a good chance that it holds some power over you. And that at some moment in the future, the universe will likely give you an opportunity to be curious and explore that. And so going back to this day that I keep circling around, December 7th was a really cold winter day. Minus 36, the kind of cold where after a few days you no longer feel resilient about being Canadian or living in Alberta. You're like, why the hell am I here? Why didn't I buy that winter place in Arizona? You're definitely pondering what's the point here. And I remember I used to watch my nephew overnight. His name is Kalen, and he was absolutely enamored with his grandmother. And I took him overnight because my sister worked an overnight shift in a group home. And so 4 nights a week I watched him for her. And typically, as long as we weren't fighting, I would get a ride to work. That was the deal. And on this morning in particular, my nephew really wanted to look at pictures of my mom. And I don't know if that was unique to that day, if he had some sort of a premonition, because it was around the time that she would have gone missing. And yet, for me, it was just to give him something to keep himself busy while I got ready for my job. And off I went to work. My sister drove me. I recall hearing some sort of a mention there was a cafe beside A&B Sound downtown where I worked, and I remember I was having coffee before I started my shift and smoking and writing in my journal, and that was a pretty strong basis of my life, actually, writing in my journal, smoking and drinking coffee. I think that's what I'd be doing if I wasn't working. And so I didn't pay attention to the news. I kind of remember that there was something mentioned about a woman missing, but who pays attention to that? You don't actually think that anything personal could be included in a broadcast. When I got into work, I had a customer who was looking for what album a Willie Nelson song was on. And I'd maybe been in work for about 20 minutes, and back in those days, there was no internet. imagine. You couldn't look it up. There was like a catalog that was like 5,000 pages long that you could sometimes find, songs in. But I just thought, well, I'll just phone my mom at work, right? She might know. Willie Nelson having, her being a fan of his, and me having grown up hearing many Willie Nelson songs. So I phoned her at work, and when I phone my mom at work, because I am the better of two daughters, I would often say, it's Sheila's favorite daughter calling, And the woman at the other end, like this was my first indication that there was a problem, was really confused and asking me lots of questions. It didn't sound like the regular secretary. And so I repeated myself, well, it's Sheila's favorite daughter. And again, the woman seemed really confused. And finally, I was just like, it's Sarah. Like, where's my mom? And the woman proceeded to tell me her name and who she was, and that my mom hadn't come into work that day, that my dad was there, and that they were waiting for the police. And I'm still, she's saying this so matter-of-factly. I have a customer literally standing like right in front of a counter right here, and I'm holding this phone. And what do you do, right? She said, I think she said, I'll have your dad contact you. I just dropped the phone and slowly fell to the ground. I think another staff helped the customer. I don't know if you ever found that Willie Nelson song. I never even really thought about that actually until this moment, despite how many times I've told the story. And so in that, you have to have a sense of humor when you're talking about trauma. You just don't get through it. And so in that first few hours, I eventually ended up at my aunt's house, which is not far from here. And that kind of became the family meeting place over the next few days. We found ourselves just waiting for the phone to ring, or the newscast to give us some information, or a detective to come by, because all of these things slowly happen over the course of someone going missing. Of course, that also meant that close family members, the men in the family, were questioned by the police, because it's really rare for somebody to be accosted by a stranger. So my dad and my grandfather would have gone through some pretty intense interviews from the police in that time period. By the end of that first day, her vehicle was found abandoned in an apartment building, maybe off of Jasper Ave and 80th, something like that. And there was DNA evidence found in the car, as well as blood found in the back, behind the seat. There was a police officer that came to my dad's house that evening, and I remember asking him about this. And I've often thought of, just what a blessing it was for his response, because I wasn't in a place where I was able of taking in any really more hard evidence at that point. And so I said, well, what about that blood found in the car? And he said, well, you could lose that much blood just by cutting your finger. And so for years I've thought, thank you for telling me that. Because at that time, on that first day, that's what I needed to hear, right? That's what I needed to hear. There was a friend of the family, and I actually think this might have been you, Ray, now that I'm saying this, who had suggested to imagine that I could send my mom loving or healing energy. Kind of like Reiki, although I didn't know much of what that was at the time, but just to imagine that I could put my hands on her head and send her healing energy. I think that they might have even been doing a healing circle for her, but that would have felt too vulnerable to me to attend. However, I used this idea of sending her healing energy, and I would do it every night. I just would pray my ass off and think, if there's anything in my power to generate the outcome I want. That's the other thing when somebody goes missing, and when you're in that state of the unknown, you want to do anything you can or that's in your power to control. But the truth is, you don't have any control. There's nothing in your power. And yet something like a visualization at least helped me to imagine the outcome I wanted, which was the one where she was found alive, and helped my mind a little bit to stay away from the one that I didn't want to imagine, which went all over the place, from her being held captive somewhere to worst case scenarios. And that's what happens with our mind when we're in that place of the unknown. By the fourth day of her being missing, we had no evidence. And there had been, massive search throughout Edmonton, through the police, through the community, many volunteers, but there was so much snow. And it was so cold. It was still minus 36, right? It was just a brutally cold winter season. And it was discovered that there was some grass indicative of the car having been off-road in the wheel well. And so they did know that it had been somewhere in that first day that was in the country. But again, no other clues were found. And so my dad decided to hold a press conference, and being a really private person, had to really step up as far as allowing himself to be the spokesperson for the family. Often I think of what a blessing that there wasn't social media then, when I've supported people who have gone through homicide more currently, and just how difficult that can be with the social media. Just the Journal and the Sun were enough at that time. And so my dad thought, well, let's make the media work for us, and let's keep her spirit alive. Because another thing is with women who go missing, is that it's so easy for them to just fall to the wayside. And it's just another missing woman. So by sharing a little bit about her personally, perhaps maybe we could incite interest in her spirit within the general population. And through that interest, maybe people would look and maybe something would happen. And so, my brother, sister, and I wrote some stories that my dad read, so did my aunties. And the mind is still present while you're doing this. There's still the part of me that's like, this is so weird, that I'm wanting to get people interested in my mom because she's missing, or this is so weird, that's my mom on the news again. Just every day, like, this is just so weird. And just having to be with how weird that was. So one of the really important pieces that came out of that press conference is that it was the first important clue, is that my mom had a one-of-a-kind ring back in, I think, 93, let's say, a couple of years before she passed. My dad had made this unique ring for her, and it was a gold ring with a pearl on it. And my mom didn't have actually any valuable jewelry, just wasn't her thing. So this stood out, and my aunt remembered that she'd had this ring. And I really think that it was a last minute Christmas present. I know, like, my dad probably went in at like December 23rd and begged the guy at Collingwood Jewelers to, I need a gift for my wife, right? And the blessing in that is that the guy still had the mold. And so we had the ring remade and showed the ring at the press conference. And this was the first important clue that led to something valuable. And so later on that day, after this was shown, the owner or the bartender at the International Hotel, which was a hotel downtown here that's now closed, came forward that he had bought this ring off of a man by the name of Peter John Bright Eyes. And so at that point, we at least knew somebody who was in connection with Mom. And over the course of the next few days, there was a Canadian-wide warrant issued for his arrest. By the 10th or 11th day of her missing, there was a farmer who lived in Chipman, Alberta, who went out to an abandoned farmhouse on his land. Again, it was so cold, and there was an old wood stove in there that I believe he was bringing into his home. And when he went into this abandoned house, he found my mother's body lying inside of there. She had been thrown in a window. She was only partially dressed and frozen to the ground. Later on that night, Bright Eyes turned himself in to one of the police stations in Edmonton, pleading not guilty, and he did have DNA evidence, blood of my mother's on his shoes, which came up in trial. And so the problem with knowing what happened is that you know what happened, right? So now you can't visualize the outcome you want anymore, right? And yes, you can still find a place in your heart center, obviously, to connect with your loved one, but you have to be with the real reality that this horrible thing has happened. And no matter what I do, there's no way I can get away from it. I recall as soon as we found out, I was sitting in the family room at my auntie's house, and then I just stood up, and my stomach, had been feeling hard and sore over that 10 days. I walked to the bathroom, and I literally threw up something solid. And it was such an obvious representation of all of that hard energy that I had not been able to digest over those 10, 11 days. And so over the next year and a half after that, this is one of the things about being in shock, right? Is that you just get through each day, quite literally, to the best of your ability. And I think this is true for anyone that goes through grief and loss, is that you just get through the day. Maybe you get through the minute, actually. Maybe not even the whole minute, maybe a breath, right? It just depends on how acute it is and what place you're in and how to be with it. What I do know is that learning to be with it is what helps us to find a way to heal it. It's if we're running away from it or if we're avoiding it, that we become more trapped and more bound by it. One of the blessings in Sheila Salter being my mom is that she had gifted me with so many profound life skills teachings because she was actually a life coach. And so I had grown up hearing different New Age sayings from the time I was like 8 years old, such as, Sarah, there's no accidents. Sarah, everything happens for a reason. Sarah, we choose our lives. Sarah, Sarah, Sarah. And after she had passed, it didn't lessen. She was louder, right? And so I would be going about my day and I could just hear her in my head and I'd argue with her out loud. If I was alone, but maybe not always alone, I don't remember. But I would argue with her out loud. I'd be like, Mom, I used to believe you, but I'm really struggling with that right now. She's the one who taught me to listen to my intuition and to trust my gut instinct, which had worked. There was many times I had, whether it was when I had been hitchhiking or after I got mugged and didn't listen to my intuition, that I really started to recognize the subtle ways in which our body talks to us and helps to keep us safe from harm. And yet my mom trusted her intuition. She listened to her gut and she was dead. And so grappling with that paradox was really difficult. And being somebody who really likes there to be meaning and purpose in everything was a struggle for some time period, right? It didn't come overnight. In those first few years, I would often be the, kind of wild, crazy hippie kid walking through Mill Creek Ravine in my bare feet, singing Amazing Grace at the top of my lungs and crying and wailing and letting whatever needed to come through me, come through me. I didn't care what the cyclists thought on the trails or anybody walking their dogs. I was in my own world. They didn't exist, right? I knew that I had to let this energy out because one of the really important pieces with grief is the feelings connected to it. And our feelings are, they demand some sort of movement in order to be expressed. I'm going to read a little piece about that actually for you that I think will be super helpful to illustrate. Just let me look in my book that I wrote. And I'll tell you. To heal trauma, we must be our own barometer. We must be our own barometer for emotional expression. We are called to trust what we feel, even when that feeling is different from what we think we should feel, or what we assume others think we should feel. It is the heart, not the mind, that must lead the way to express what is within. Emotions have no expiry date. They do not go away when unaddressed. Instead, they fester and poison us. Feelings are energy. that transforms through communication. So we have to think of what the communication is for our feelings. Communication is a synonym in this instance for movement and expression. The tools are verbalizing, writing, physical movement, art, music, ceremony, prayer. These acts propel you forward by drawing you deeper. This is not easy for many of us, particularly when trauma results in disembodiment. It's difficult to get back into your body, to heal and to feel the trauma. And yet, in order for us to heal it, we have to examine what gets in the way of touching our emotional content. And so here I explore a little bit in the book of the reasons why we don't feel. We think our trauma is too big to feel. We think it's too small to feel. We think we have to be a hero. We have all these ways to justify why not to. But here's one thing that is always true, is that our experience of freedom is possible at any time. At any time, we are able to access our experience of freedom. We're able to feel free. And what keeps us from feeling free is our unexpressed emotions and trauma. They weigh us down, they hang out in our body, they make us uncomfortable, they wrap these energy cords around us, they build up in our throat, and it can be so difficult to be seen in our vulnerability. But if we don't let ourselves be seen in our vulnerability, we are stuck. And we can tell this by the things that we're afraid to talk about or that are uncomfortable. And so though I'm speaking candidly about my mom's homicide now, I sure as hell didn't do that in the first 10 years of her death. You know, I would avoid getting into a situation where people would say, "How did your mom die?" It was so uncomfortable. Then I would have to speak it to strangers, and that didn't feel fair. Why should they get to know? I hadn't tended to it yet. You know, it was still raw. And it was raw over that course of time, no matter how many times I sang Amazing Grace in that damn River Valley. You know, like it's because I was doing that in the private context, but our healing needs community. We have to be seen in it. And so that meant that until I felt safe and could create a safe space where I could speak it out loud, not to strangers initially, this took time, but to people in a safe circle of friends or others. You know, and you get that feeling of your story, it's like it's heavy on your body. You know, for me, it would almost be the shame or the worry of like, what will they think? Or what will happen if I speak this? Or almost like the world's gonna end. There would be a buildup, like of anxiety. And I'd know I'd have to say it. And sometimes I'd be about to, and I stopped. And then I'd feel ashamed that I let myself down because I knew I needed to do it for me. And so eventually, we don't want to let ourselves down anymore. And we come to the place where we know that we're all we got, right? We have to show up for ourselves. We are the only one who can do it for us in this life. And so taking that time to honor and acknowledge and celebrate any of those emotions is absolutely essential. Acknowledging the fear that is related to that is also essential. I had two big fears after she died. One was walking at night. I loved walking at night. And because I believed in my gut instinct before she died, I walked at night. You know, I lived downtown and I would go down into the river valley, and it's true that I would do it quite like stealthily. You know, I would be really careful about if there was anyone out there, but I would crouch down in the grass. Literally, I'm not kidding. and pretend there was a wolf. And listen and make sure it was safe before I went and ran through Victoria Golf Course at night under the full moon, likely with my tarot cards in my bag so that I could go and read them and be outside. I thought it was only fair that I should get to be outside. Why couldn't I be outside because I was a woman and feel safe? And that really bothered me. And so after she died, it took me a few years to build up the courage to change this. And one piece of courage was I got a German Shepherd. And, you know, when she was about 7 months old, maybe she wasn't quite that tough yet, but I staged this walk for myself one night where I was living not even 10 blocks from the parkade. And I made myself go out at night, and it was very literally, I was up against the edge of buildings as if it was like a police drama, where I was checking, is it safe to go around here? And I was so scared of a random person killing me. And I needed to address that fear. I had to cross a big school field, and I ran from shadow to shadow, right? And then I was like, maybe the shadow is not a good idea, right? Like maybe I should have been in the open, and trying to figure out a way, again, because I'm responsible for my freedom, nobody else. I'm the one who decides it. And so I needed to find a way and create an experience where I wasn't afraid to do that. A year and a half after she died, Peter Bright Eyes was found guilty of murder 1. And so in the course of that 6-week trial, obviously more and more details were unpacked about her death and how she died. Back in that time period, few people had internet. You couldn't access this information of like what went down in murder trials, not in the way we can now. There wasn't CSI, or maybe it just started. Either way, I went to the trial for only a few of those days, because over the course of 6 weeks, it was just too much information. Bright Eyes was there. I remember feeling like he wasn't in his body, wasn't present. And I would make myself look at him, but he never looked towards us, or not the days that I was there, that I can recall. When the blood splatter expert testified, this was the first time I had ever encountered somebody speaking about a struggle or an act of violence using what's left behind as the information that tells the tale. So they were using my mom's vehicle, what was found on the ground of the parkade, on the walls, and on the vehicles that had been parked beside her. One of the most difficult things about going through a trial is that your loved one is objectified. And I think that's a fault in our judicial system. I think objectifying the person who has died is dismissing their humanity. I also think that we need to find humanity with the perpetrator as well, and I'll get to that. But in that space of objectification, I had to listen to my mom referred to as blood source, active blood source and terminated blood source, actually. And I can say this with humor now. Totally, right? Because you have to laugh. And 25, 26 years later, it's a lot easier to laugh, but quite literally, you're hearing him describe that, and you're hearing him explain that when she was moved from one part of the car to the other, that she was tipped and loaded into the back, and quite likely was no longer an active blood source. And I was reading this a few years ago when I was going through some trial notes of a friend of the family, just to make sure I was accurate in what I was putting into the book. And remembering, right, that particular day, that might have been the 3rd time I went to the trial and the last, because it was so difficult to hear that. But what ended up coming out of the trial was the realization that she would have been attacked coming out of her car, and that there would have been violent struggle in the course of 10 to 15 minutes in the parkade, that she was attacked with a knife. The knife had come from the apartment of a girlfriend of his that lived across the street, who had bravely shared evidence and information in the trial. Her throat was slit, she was raped, she was thrown into the back of her vehicle, and shortly thereafter taken out to Chipman, Alberta, where she would have been thrown into the farmhouse. And so because we had kidnapping, we had sexual assault, and we had homicide, Bright Eyes was found guilty of murder 1. Right after, I think the day after, he went to the Edmonton Max, he hung himself by his shoelaces in prison and suicided. And so here there are 2 people who are senselessly dead. And having always had such faith that there's meaning in what happens in life, I was sitting there thinking, like, what's the point of it all? And all I knew about him was what had been shared in the news. He had been out of prison for 6 days. before he killed my mom. He had been in and out of the system his whole life, from the time he was a small boy in foster care. And even when I was in the trial, I remember thinking, like, so this is really strange that he was released from this system 6 days before she was killed. And now we're depending on this system to offer up some sort of reparation for the harm that's done. And yet simultaneously knowing that this is a person who's actually could be quite harmful and really could hurt another person. And so what other choice do you have, right? It wasn't safe for him to be on the streets. And I knew that once he was found guilty, it was a couple of weeks before he went from the Edmonton remand to the Edmonton Max. So even in that time period, thinking will there be actually any rehabilitation? Like, is there any point to our system at all? And yet at the same time, knowing that he was the face of my greatest fear. And so not wanting him to be out on the street either, right? So these are some of the struggles that we go through when we have to experience the justice system firsthand, and likely have been much of what encouraged me to explore some training in restorative justice. So as much as I said earlier that I come entirely from an energy healing point of view, I have also taken training such as Peace Circle facilitation, or a program called Strategies for Trauma Awareness and Resilience out of Washington, D.C., and a couple of other things that just add to that awareness that there needs to be different ways for us to tend to not just justice outside of ourselves, so not just facing those really difficult things, but how we face them inside of ourselves, and that the two are so intricately connected. And so over those 10 years, I've shared with you, I faced my fear. I walked with that dog and as if I was on Matlock through the 124th Street area, and found all these different ways to express feelings and go through this sense of metabolization, do all the grieving I needed to do. I was blessed with having twins the first pregnancy, so I got to become a mother firsthand and learned so much about my mom, I feel, by becoming a mom. I still love being a mom. And after about 10 years, I felt like I was at peace with her death. That I had come to a place of accepting her death. And I had an experience too. It wasn't just overnight. Like, I actually literally had an experience of feeling her spirit come to me and take me through those last minutes of her death and show me this place of peace and bliss that I've never seen or felt or sensed in my human experience. And I knew she was showing me she was okay. But I still didn't feel at peace. I said I'm pretty conscious of the sensation of freedom in my body. I didn't feel at peace. Well, here's the thing. I had never, ever expressed any anger towards her perpetrator. I had never addressed it. I thought, what's the point, right? He had a hard life. He's dead. What do you do? Right? Like, what do you do? He hadn't killed me. So, I didn't know that I could express any anger towards him, right? I mean, maybe I didn't recognize initially that we were even connected, right? And that I needed to somehow address the energy towards him. But after my son was born, one of the things about birth is that our hearts become so open, and it's possible for us to listen really deeply, I feel, in ways that are very unique. And in that time period, I could feel Peter Bright Eyes around me, and decided to go and see a psychologist. I thought, maybe I need to address this. I was, using all the energy I could to not think about him. Because it's true, we don't want to think about ugly things, right? Who wants to think about an ugly thing? He was the face of the bad guy. In my family, we vilified him. He was bad. Evidently, when we knew all the details of what he had done to my mom and her body. So this is a bad guy. And yet he's popping up in my head, often at intimate moments where I'm having a heart connection with somebody I care about. And it was almost like his face was like, nah, boo-boo, think about this now. You're feeling peaceful? Well, I'm gonna mess that peace up. And so realizing that maybe I needed to address this, I went to see this psychologist. Now, there's many ways to find a good therapist. This is a way I don't recommend. I took the yellow pages. Who remembers yellow pages? Okay. I went like this, under psychologist. And when I stopped on a page, I put my finger on it, I'm like, okay, I'll go see that person. Now, I'd never seen a psychologist. I was 30. I didn't have many friends who had seen psychologists. You know, I had coverage, so I thought that was great for maybe 2 sessions. So I thought, well, you know, I'll try this out. People do this when they are going through grief and loss. Now, unfortunately or fortunately, it depends on your point of view. I went to see this woman. I told her a little bit of the story, and I said, I'm feeling angry, and I feel this guy around me. You know, like, advice, what do I do? And I was hoping there'd be some, here's how you address this. No, I didn't get that. Here's what I got. Why don't you imagine him surrounded by a pink light and see him slowly disappearing? And I looked at her like she was crazy. And I was like, thinking in my head, I have some woo-woo friends who could give me that shit for free. Right? Like, you know, I've just paid $200 for pink light. Like, really? And so I just said, I don't think that's going to be strong enough for me. And so then she said, okay, why don't you just picture him in an air balloon and see him slowly floating away? Really? And again, I looked at her like, What I was thinking is that I wanted to climb into that wolf body I mentioned earlier and eat him, right? And I thought, well, I don't know if I should share that with her. It doesn't feel like the space. And so I went home, and initially I felt really disappointed. You know, I thought that there was going to be this person who was an expert, and they were going to have ideas for me, and it was going to help me to do something. And like, I'm an action person. I want to address shit. I don't like leaving stuff to the wayside. I always believe that there's a way forward. And in some ways, it was like my uber teenage punk rock self was challenged by all the people I'd met in my life that said, oh, homicide, you're kind of stuck, sorry. And I was like, oh yeah, I'll show you. I'll find a way through this. If you can heal murder, I'm on it. And bless the determination of that part of me, because after sitting with my disappointment for a little bit, I thought, Sarah, this is silly. You know how to pray. You know how to create ceremony. You know how to address issues. Create your own experience. Talk to his spirit. Talk to him. You know, this is what's happening. You're using all this energy to push him away. Call him in. Find out what happens. Call him directly in. He is the face of your biggest fear. So let's bring it right here where it already is. Instead of avoiding it, instead of pretending it's not there, instead of doing everything you can to get away from it, let's bring it really close. And so I did over the course of 9 months. Now that can be a long ceremony. I didn't plan on it being 9 months. I just knew that I would once a week for an hour, hour and a half, until the energy shifted in my body. I had a whole bunch of time in my day because my twin girls were in kindergarten and my son napped for an hour and a half. So I was like, I have so much time. I'm gonna make use of this time. And so what did that look like? It looked like me saying some sort of a prayer like I started out with. It looked like me saying, okay, well, where am I holding this in my body? And what does that part of my body want to say? And what do I need to say to him? Because I'd never expressed my sense of victimization to him. I don't want to be a victim. Who wants to be a victim? So my hard-ass attitude had kept me from actually acknowledging that this person's power had directly impacted my life. And in order to reclaim my power, I needed to say, how dare you? Who do you think you are? This is what you did, and this is the consequence it's had on my life and my children's lives and the lives of my family. And I needed to speak that out loud. And so expressing our experience of victimization doesn't mean we are victims. It means we're acknowledging the truth. There was an experience where we had no power. And we were subjugated to somebody else's power. And as difficult as that is to acknowledge our powerlessness or that we had no control, it's true. And when we're able to acknowledge it, something changes inside of our bodies because we're standing up for ourselves. We're doing what nobody else did. We're saying, I value you enough to stand up and express this. And because I value you enough to stand up and express that, eventually that feeling of victimization changes. You're not holding it in the same way anymore. And so I screamed and shouted out loud. I played my drum. I wrote letters and burned them in our fireplace. Sometimes through the years as I've shared this story, I thought, wow, William was a really good napper. But the funny thing that his family members know that I'm going to say right now is that William's hard of hearing. But we didn't actually know that until he was about 5. But in hindsight, when I think of that, I'm like, that makes sense. And so this was, the time to express any unresolved anger and giving myself permission, because I'm somebody who likes the uncomfortable feeling of anger, right? Who wants to be angry? And being such a peacemaker, I was so good at understanding my anger away. And so for the first time, I was really showing up for myself and for what needed to be said in a healthy environment. He didn't have to be alive to hear me. And even whether you believe his spirit was there or not doesn't matter. What matters is that I addressed the person who did me wrong. And all of us have had moments in our lives where we've been subjugated to another's power and maybe pushed it away or laughed it off and not recognized how relevant it is for us to reclaim our power and step into our own strength in speaking to that. Now, 2 months into the ceremony, I had an experience that changed my life forever. It was totally unexpected. As I said, I had began my spiritual practice quite devoutly at the age of 17 and pursued trainings or classes or anything that I could take that would help to support me on that journey. And I felt comfortable with something called journey. It can also be called a led meditation or a shamanic journey or a visualization or a vision. And basically what that looked like is going into a deep meditative state and asking Spirit to show me what I needed to see that was still unresolved. So what is still existing in my relationship with this bright eyes that I need to express? And this really funny thing happened. I saw myself sitting on a sand wall. There was a small pyramid in front of me. And I had my arm around this little boy. He was about 10 years old. And I knew that there was something he'd done wrong and he had to go to this pyramid and talk to somebody and, take responsibility for something. But I was in this deep trance-like state. And so I was just comforting him. I was letting him talk to me. I was offering him compassion and really holding him near. And then my conscious mind kicked in. And I realized that this little boy in my vision was Peter Bright Eyes. And I realized that I had just had this deep, profound sense of compassion for the biggest bad guy in my life. And I pulled myself out of that journey with honestly a lot of swearing. And then my next response was, oh my God, what will I tell my family? How could I feel that? I felt like feeling that had betrayed my family, because of what he had done in our lives. And yet, a seed of compassion was planted inside of me. As much as I was angry that compassion hijacked my anger, I couldn't ignore it. And so I simultaneously had this feeling of compassion and this feeling of anger both hanging out together inside of me, really uncomfortable. Trying to figure out, what do I do? Do I want to, express all of this anger? Do I want to be at peace and be curious about who he is? I had to sit with that for a couple of years. But I can't deny that what was planted that day led me on this profound journey of wanting to understand who he was. This profound journey of shared humanity. Because what I recognized in that moment is that my soul is not better than his. There was this deep humbling that happened. I don't know if I recognized that I thought it was better than his until I had this heart-to-heart moment in that 1-minute journey that so impacted me. So if my soul wasn't better than his, what did that mean, right? I guess I had this idea that there was tiers of tier levels maybe of where we go based on what we do and who we are? I'm not sure. All I know is that I started to recognize that there was more to him than the guy that was hiding in the parkade the day that my mom pulled in with her white Chevy Blazer. There was more to him than that. He was also somebody's son. He was also somebody's brother. His AA book ended up in my hands years later, long story, and inside of it, it said, "Thank you for all of your help. Keep on loving yourself." He was also somebody who at some point loved himself. So who was this guy? And why did my knowing that matter? You know, that voice of my mom in my head, there's purpose in everything. There's no accidents. Everything happens for a reason. And this feeling in my body that somehow this mattered. I had to understand where this guy came from. Again, this wasn't an overnight affair. Some of you have been my friends for long enough that have witnessed some of this journey and watched as I've kind of figured this out through the years. And so it was 2010, 4 years after I first felt that experience of compassion, that I had another vision that was really clear. I had to meet his ancestors. I had to walk on the land from where he was born. And I knew that somehow understanding this would lead even more deeply to understanding Mom's homicide. Because here's the thing, if I could do anything to prevent somebody else from losing their mother in such a way, I'll do it. If that meant that I had to learn more about this guy, if that meant I had to understand the root of violence and be curious about the root of violence in a way where I'm also not taking it personally, in a way where I can witness and step back enough to recognize that that heinous act is sourced in other heinous acts, and it all starts somewhere. And so that journey to Saddle Lake cremation happened in the fall of 2010. Prior to that, I remembered that Peter had a sister named Marilyn. I knew this because she was in a CBC documentary called Beating the Streets that was produced by a friend of Ray's, Lorna Thomas, in 1996. And by 2010, there's social media, right? So now there's internet. So I thought, well, I know there's a Marilyn, and maybe her last name's Bright Eyes. I wonder what will happen if I contact her. And I was totally freaked out, right? Because I knew I wanted something from her, but I didn't know what it was. You know, I just knew, and I knew I was following a vision, like literally, like, hi, I had a vision. Your brother killed my mom. Will you talk to me? Like, I didn't know, like, how do you do this? I didn't know how to do it. I was just like, okay, ancestors, I'm listening. And so I found a way to approach her. I think I was like as tentative and cautious and yet revealing enough that I was open-hearted, and she was really willing to have any conversation she could with me. Her brother was 13 years older than her, so she felt that the best way to share would be to share her story and to recognize any ways that there was connection through having come from the same mother and the same family, and even her experiences with her brother as well. And but she wasn't living in Saddle Lake, she was in BC. So I contacted the Saddle Lake cremation, and I was put in touch with a former chief by the name of Eric Large, who was appointed to work with me and just share and answer any questions that I had. And I went out there in the day after my birthday, actually, of 2010. So I guess I would have been 35. I had to look for some confirmation. And I'm like, right, wasn't I? Let's do the math. So Remembrance Day of 2010. And Eric was really lovely and willing to share any information that he had answers for. And a lot of it was about historical trauma. So a lot of it was about suicide rates on the reserve at that time, and about the impact of residential schools, and about 60s scoop, and about compound trauma and generational trauma. And like many people of white settler background, I had this idea that I knew about the history of colonization in Canada, and I think I was totally ignorant. I even had you know, my token good friend who is Dene, who I thought, well, I have a good friend. She's Dene. We went to high school together. I know what it's like. You know, I'm open-minded. I know. I knew nothing, right? I just really knew nothing. And so the beautiful thing about knowing nothing and realizing it is that you're able to listen. And so I spent a lot of time listening. I was invited to come and share my story, similar to this, many times in Saddle Lake through Eric. He worked for the Indian Resolution Health Services Organization. And I shared in a teepee that he ran at Blue Quill Culture Camp, as well as some other places over the course of about 5 years. Now, often when I was in the teepee, I actually felt like inadequate in many ways because I was learning so much. I was just sharing a story, and I was learning so much from all the people that came into the circle, particularly some of the elders that came and sat in the circle, and hearing stories that were so profoundly traumatic about subjugation of power and trauma. Just, you know, they leave marks on your soul. One elder would speak about how hard his dad tried to provide for the family, but during the pass system, which I believe went until the 50s, the family was not allowed off the reserve without permission from the Indian agent. So even though they grew things that they could sell and make money and provide, they weren't allowed to leave to go to town to sell it. So his dad would load the wagon in the evening, and when it was dark, they would go into town, stay for the day, undercover, sell things, come back again at night. And so just hearing him talk about how hard his dad had worked, and this probably would have been in the 40s, thinking about the age of this elder, in order to provide, and how much that was suppressed. At one point, I was given a tour of Blue Quills College, which is the former residential school by Eric, actually, who went there. And it's highly recommended as a point of education to recognize the history that's still present. Marilyn and I met in 2013 also at Blue Quill College because I was doing a circle there. And right from the very beginning, we felt this really profound connection. It was so strange and so uncomfortable and so important. It's still so strange and so uncomfortable and so important. And so what happened is we end up walking the grounds, and I'm very aware that this is where her mom went to school and where her sisters went to school. And I'm aware that some of the trauma that she's shared that was passed down through those experiences is very likely the direct trauma that impacted Peter to be in the parkade that day that killed my mother. And in recognizing that, there's such a deep awareness that we can't pigeonhole trauma into these tiny compartments or spaces and think that they only belong to the people who have been traumatized. It doesn't work that way. We're all responsible for attending to and creating healing. Marilyn is under the FASD umbrella. I can't remember the exact name. It's like she's a bit of a brain disorder. She speaks of it when we do talks together. And it's important to share that piece as a segue to what I'm about to say because she has no filter. She quite bravely and courageously, but she says it's because she has no filter, will just say anything. She'll speak what happened like it is. And so we've just spent 3 hours sharing each other's stories, walking around these grounds. We're now making rattles together. This is, that first day that we actually met in person. And she says, so I have a question for you. And I said, okay. And she says, why was your mom so important? And I'm sewing, I'm listening. And she said, Native women go missing all the time. Native women, are murdered and missing all the time. Nothing is done. She said, no offense, but why was your mom so important? And I said, that's a really good question. It's a really good question. Why? I said, I'm happy she was important because she's my mom. And I also get a deep injustice that that's a truth and that's not okay. And so the beauty in any time that we share together is that we both learn so deeply from each other. What ended up happening from that meeting is that Marilyn and I do talks where I'll share my story and she'll share her story. And we've spoken at the Edmonton Women's Prison, for FASD Central Alberta, High Level Native Friendship Center, High Prairie Firekeepers Conference, quite a few other places around Alberta through the years. We were actually speaking at Boyle Street for a couple of hundred people, frontline support workers, right when the pandemic started, and had to cancel another talk and stuff that we had. And so what I have to say, because you've been a beautifully patient audience and I've been speaking for a while, what I have to say about going into those deep, dark places, which I reference as the underworld in my book, is that it is so worth it. Because in that soul territory, we find out parts of ourselves that we never would have imagined were possible. I can't put my relationship with Marilyn Bright Eyes into a box, right? It's something entirely unexpected, and she's one of the most important teachers in my life, you know? And it's through understanding and listening to each other that we've both been able to ripple out and have an impact in our own lives for healing and in those that we encounter. I also need to add that I didn't forgive Bright Eyes overnight. I didn't have that experience of compassion and then I was like, I forgive you. Not at all. I had to really be with that. And this is a short piece, so I'll just read a little piece about forgiveness, because I think that it's really important when we contemplate what authentic forgiveness is and we're curious about what that can mean for us. So in chapter 8, where I speak to the teachings of forgiveness, I segue this chapter with a quote from Archbishop Desmond Tutu, who has a really great book called The Book of Forgiving. Highly recommended. So when I am asked whether some people are beyond forgiveness, my answer is no. My heart has been broken 1,000 times over at the cruelty and suffering I have seen human beings unjustly and mercilessly inflict upon one another. Yet still I know and believe forgiveness is always called for, and reconciliation is possible. Archbishop Desmond Tutu. Now this part's by Sarah Salter Kelly. At the time of her life, my mother had the following affirmation on her bedroom mirror. I forgive myself. I forgive everyone. I am free. She was 42. The power of her words were not lost on me. I mean, come on. What are the chances of a woman who was brutally murdered having such a straightforward affirmation about forgiveness on her mirror? Forgiveness had not been anywhere on my radar until after the ceremony with Bright Eyes. Before that, my grief process took precedence over his role in what had happened. To examine forgiveness too early would have felt like he was being given greater importance than the very real loss of my mother and the violence of how it all went down. Instead, I began to contemplate it organically as an obvious part of metabolization in time. My thoughts naturally started to turn towards wondering what forgiveness was and what it meant for me. It's easy to slap forgiveness on top of pain without it being embodied or authentic. Like, how often do we see that? It's easy to say I forgive you and not live it or practice it. I needed to know what real forgiveness was for me. Initially, I was concerned that if I forgave him, he would get to keep a part of me that didn't belong to him, or that he'd won, or that I was saying that what he did was okay, or that I would betray my mom. After I'd expressed all of my anger and pent-up emotions, I started to sit with this more. I went back and back with these ideas for a while, and then I found myself in this training in the Peace Country of Alberta. And one of the exercises that we had was to make a mandala representing our greatest teachers. And, I had gathered things just organically using my intuition, and I sat down and I was making this mandala, and with each object that I grabbed, I blew whoever it was into the mandala. And then, kind of looked at what I was making and was curious about what it symbolized. And I got to my very last piece, and I'd already named my parents and any obvious other mentors or teachers, and I picked this piece up, and I automatically knew that Peter Bright Eyes was one of my greatest teachers. And I had this feeling of like shivers running through my body and a sense of awe because I knew it was true. And I knew that it was time to forgive him. And so I knew to do so would honor the teachings coming into my life. Obviously, I was not grateful that I'd lost my mother or that he had killed her. But by being willing to look at this loss, to deepen my understanding of who I am, I had come to a place where forgiveness was an option, and I was grateful for that. It was important for me to forgive without trying to make the heinous act of violence he committed okay in any way. I didn't try and pretty it up, consider it an accident, or make any excuse for his actions. I needed to forgive as is. So, what I'm going to invite you to do is to close your eyes and feel that stone that you've been holding in your hands, for those of you who are in this present space. And for those of you who are on Zoom, simply to bring your awareness into your own physical body and just let yourself notice what has shown up for you and what is percolating, and if there's any part of your body that is specifically drawing your attention. For us in this room, start to feel that stone that's in your hand. And maybe open your eyes a little and just start to look at it. How does this somehow, or does it, connect to whatever has come up for you over the course of the hour as you've listened? And this can be really simple. It feels good in my hand. It helped me to not be bored while you were talking. Letting yourself be curious, because you didn't know what was going to come up for you. You didn't know what I was going to say, neither did I. And so letting yourself go, oh, okay, it has this marking here. Maybe that represents that one thing I was noticing in my left shoulder, or that feeling in my throat when she said this piece that made it hard to swallow. Just letting yourself observe. This is the invitation of trauma as medicine, is to invite in that curiosity to those difficult places we hold inside of ourselves, those difficult parts of being human. And the truth is, they never go away. They're always a part of our practice, right? That's a day-to-day thing. Even forgiveness. You know, we don't arrive. We don't get somewhere and we're healed. Hallelujah. It's that cyclical practice of investigation and curiosity and being willing to honor our hearts, what we have inside of them, and trust and embody the courage to show up. And so from that place, I want to thank you for listening, and we're going to take time to invite in questions or comments. So I'm going to actually do that by sharing my stones. What I will do is I'm going to pass it this way, and if you have nothing to say other than your name, just say hi. Okay, thank you. And pause for 1 second. And so the people on Zoom, I'm going to close with you now because we're doing a round, and I want to really thank you for participating, and I would like you to email me and let me know how it was, because I was talking in the wrong camera, so I've never done this before. Okay? Thank you. Okay, thank you.
I just wanted to express gratitude for you, for sharing your story. There was some messages that I needed to hear today, and I'm really grateful. Thank you.
There was actually a lot of things you shared that I had no idea some of it, so that was pretty cool to hear some of them. Yeah.
Thank you, Haley.
I didn't know there was public speaking today. This is what I was scared of when I came here.
Perfect. Perfect.
No, I learned a lot from that story. I didn't really know any of the details of anything. So it was really interesting to hear it from your perspective after already having gone through all of that. So I really appreciate you sharing all of that with us. Yeah, and I'm Peyton.
Peyton is my niece.
I just want to say it's an absolute honor to witness your transformation over the last 20 years. The details put together in your head are so clear now. And I'm so grateful for you and your friendship and for the wisdom that you are sharing with more people than you know, Sarah.
Thank you, sweetie. Let me just like this. Just shutting this all off. Oh, oh.